we welcome you all. And without any further delay, let's get started with the talk. And with a virtual round of applause, I hand it over to you, Ayush Singh.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope I'm audible. So I'll be talking about the relation between angular momentum, mainly how angular momentum is studied in quantum mechanics, and the rotation group. So the group of all rotations in 3 dimensions. So there is a very nice relation between these, and actually in the first quantum mechanics course that most people do, where we solve the angular momentum problem, as it's called in most textbooks, um, what we're doing essentially is classifying all irreducible representations of the rotation group. So that's a lot of words. It's a mouthful. But we'll try to unpack that as the talk progresses. Okay, so there are a few natural stopping points where I can take questions. But if there's a small doubt, a small clarification or anything, if you spot a mistake in the presentation or with something I do, then please feel free to unmute yourselves and point that out to me. Okay. Okay, so first thing I want to go over is the idea of a manifold. Okay, so I know all the people who are interested in physics, they will be thrown off by this, but stick with me. I'll not spend too much time on it. So I'll just state that informally, an n-dimensional manifold, which is embedded in some Euclidean space, it's a subset of that Euclidean space such that the neighborhood of every point looks like some Rn. So for example, if this is, I draw this big space Rn, and so my manifold is a set inside this such that for any arbitrary point, if I choose any point, then around this, I can make an open set such that this open set is, it's basically this open set is homeomorphic to some open set in some Rn, some smaller Euclidean space. So usually this n is smaller than capital N. Okay. Now this idea is actually very abstract. The way I have stated it is abstract. So the point is that this small, so around every point, I am making an open set, right? And that open set can be thought of as a small patch of this Rn. And the manifold, it's composed of these small patches that cover the entire set M. Okay. So here, in a few definitions, I have made this idea more precise and more clear, but we are not going to spend too much time on that. So here, now this second slide has an example of a manifold, right? So, I mean, technically this is an example of an embedding, but this is also a manifold, but again, we are not going to spend too much time on it. The idea I want to get across is that a manifold is a generalization of the Euclidean space such that things like continuous functions and derivatives of functions and tangent vectors, they still make sense. So we can make the notions of these things precise, right? So now, so for the purposes of this talk, you can think of manifolds as, let's say, surfaces. So for example, if you can imagine a two-dimensional surface in R3, so in 3 dimensions, you can imagine a surface of 2 dimensions. So a sheet of rubber or whatever. And that would be a very helpful image to keep in mind during this talk, right? So now the next thing I want to talk about is a tangent vector. Okay, so if M is my manifold, then a vector is said to be tangent if it is equal to the derivative of some curve, right? So for example, if this is so let's say that this is a curve. Let's say that, so let's say this is a one-dimensional manifold, let's say. So it's only a curve, and it's embedded in a two-dimensional space. So I'll call that R2. So a tangent is nothing but, so if I have a curve passing through any point, let's say I have this point and there's a curve passing through it, then the derivative of this curve is called the tangent vector, right? So this is, so in one dimension, this is unnecessarily complicated, but this definition generalizes to an arbitrarily large number of dimensions. Okay. This curve that I have defined, gamma, it's a function from an open set containing 0 to my manifold. Okay. So it's a curve inside the manifold such that at at 0 parameter value, we are at this point at which there is a tangent vector, and the derivative of the curve at 0, there should be 0. So that would be some vector, and that vector we say is the tangent vector. Okay. And the set of all these tangent vectors is called the tangent space of the manifold at that point x. Okay. So if I have a manifold, then at every point of that manifold, I can define a tangent space. And it turns out that this tangent space is actually a linear vector space. So the vectors, the tangent vectors, they form a vector space. And what happens usually is that if I have an n-dimensional manifold, the tangent space is going to be an n-dimensional vector space. So if we again go back to the example of a two-dimensional surface in 3 dimensions, then if we pick any point in that two-dimensional surface and we draw a tangent plane at that point, then that tangent plane is going to be the tangent space. So it's a two-dimensional vector space at that point. So that picture, I think, makes everything clear. And also, again, so this deals with the technicalities of the definition of a manifold, and it gives us a way to calculate the tangent space. So this is quite abstract, and so I'll just skip over all of this and go to the orthogonal group. Okay, so the orthogonal group, actually, so let's back up a little bit. So so I'm hoping everyone is familiar with matrices, right? So matrices are actually nothing but it's a map. It's a linear map from between two Euclidean spaces or two vector spaces. Okay, and when we are considering an n by n matrix, it means that it's a linear map between two n-dimensional vector spaces. So it's a linear map between Rn and Rn. Okay. Now there's a class of these matrices which are called orthogonal matrices, which satisfy this property. Okay. So the transpose of that matrix is actually its inverse. Now, what's interesting about this matrices is that so if these matrices act on a vector, so if my matrix A acts on a vector, then the norm of the vector that we get from that action is preserved. Okay. So this orthogonality condition ensures that there's no stretching or squishing of our vectors, right? So orthogonal matrices, they correspond either to a rotation in space or to a reflection, right? In fact, these are the only two things that characterize orthogonal matrices. So it can either be a rotation or it can be a reflection plus a rotation. And I have written here that these matrices, which are denoted ON, so n by n orthogonal matrices are denoted ON, they form a group under multiplication. So what I mean by group is that the matrix multiplication operation is closed. It's associative. And there is an identity element. So for example, so the identity matrix itself is the identity element. And for every matrix in this set, there is an inverse. Now, now all these four properties are quite easy to verify, right? So this is actually one of the first examples one gets when someone starts studying about groups. And it's also one of the most interesting examples because, as it turns out, this group ON, it's also a manifold of dimension half n minus 1. So for example, we live in 3 dimensions. So if we have the orthogonal group in 3 dimensions, so the dimension of this group manifold, it's going to be half 3 times 3 minus 1, which is 3. So this is actually a very lucky accident that in 3 dimensions, the orthogonal matrices, they have only 3 dimensions. So what this means is that basically there are 3 independent parameters that can characterize any orthogonal matrix completely, right? So you can see that when you consider this equation. So this tells you that not all of the 9 parameters in this 3 by 3 matrix are not all independent. So there are only 3 independent parameters. And for example, those who know about Euler rotations, they can see that any 3 rotation angles, they're enough to characterize any rotation, right? So this is the orthogonal group. Now here, using the regular value theorem that I did not explain, it can be shown that this group is it's a manifold, right? So this is proof of that. The interesting part here is that since it's a manifold, things like derivatives and continuous functions are well defined in this space, okay? And so is the concept of the tangent space. So if we think of this ON as a surface in some high dimensional Euclidean space Rn, so if we think of this as a surface, then we can talk about the tangent space of this surface, right? It's a bit weird, it's a bit unintuitive because how does this even compute? These are matrices, and we're talking about matrices as if they are vectors. But this is a notion that can be made precise, and in fact, we can compute the tangent space of the orthogonal matrix at the identity. So remember that since this is a group, there's an identity element, which is just the identity matrix. And we can compute the tangent space to this manifold at the identity. And it turns out that the tangent space is nothing but a set of all antisymmetric matrices. Okay, so in a sense that can be made precise, antisymmetric matrices are tangent to the rotation group at identity. Right, so these antisymmetric matrices are tangent vectors, sort of, at the identity of the rotation. Okay, so with that very quick introduction, so it might be the quickest introduction to manifolds you may ever get. We start to talk about these matrix groups in some more detail. Okay, so now M and R, this is a set of all n by n matrices. Now this can be thought of as the set as the Euclidean space R n squared, so R n by n, right? So this has n times n parameters, and this space also has n times n parameters. So they have in terms of vector spaces, they are isomorphic because they have the same dimension, right? They're finite dimensional vector spaces, and so they're isomorphic. Now, so now we can think of this set of matrices as a vector space, and also then we can define a norm, right? So there's a vector space, then we have vectors inside. So the matrices now we are going to call our vectors in an abstract vector space. And in that vector space, we can define norms of vectors, right? So the norm is defined very simply here. So we're just taking the maximum element of the matrix. So I write down the matrix, the n by n array, and I pick out the maximum element and I call that the norm. Okay. And actually, the people who are familiar with a little bit of operator theory, they'll know that a norm is defined in terms of these two relations, right? And it can be verified that this norm, it does satisfy these two relations. Okay. And now, once we have norm, a notion of a norm inside a vector space, we can talk about things like continuity and derivatives, right? So even if we don't know that this M and R, it's a manifold or whatever, an abstract object, we can do this. We can define a norm, and then we can talk about things like continuity and derivatives of matrix groups, right? So now here is a definition. It says that a Lie group, it's a very important group that crops up in lots of very disparate places in physics. So this Lie group is a group that is also a smooth manifold in which the group operations of multiplication and inversion are smooth maps. So my group operation of multiplication is going to be a map from this G cross G. So it takes two elements from the group and it assigns one other group element to it. So this map is smooth, as well as the inversion operation. So it assigns an element of the group to its inverse. This inverse operation is also smooth, right? So these are the two things we require. And for requiring these two things, we require this group to also have some sort of a norm or some structure, right? So just being a group isn't going to cut it. And since the most general kind of structure in which these derivatives are defined, we require those groups to also be smooth manifolds. So, for example, all our nice matrix groups, such as this group, GLNR. So this is the group called N by N invertible matrices. Okay, so this is a Lie group. The rotation group is also a Lie group. Okay, and so now you might, so for this case, especially for invertible matrices, it's called the general linear group of order n on real numbers. So these are n by n invertible real matrices. So here since the group multiplication operation, it just involves multiplication of the entries of matrices and addition of those entries. And those two operations we know are continuous and smooth and differentiable. So because of that, and because this space is dimensional, there's no crazy stuff happening. This tells us that this group multiplication operation is continuous and smooth. Same thing for inversion. So the matrix inverse can be written in terms of adjoints and minors and cofactors of a matrix. And all those things, again, remember, require only multiplication and addition of the different entries of the matrix. And multiplication and addition of real numbers is continuous and smooth. So the inversion operation is also smooth. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to define an exponential map for a matrix, right? So if I have a matrix X, then I can define an exponential of that matrix. So I can raise that matrix to some power X, and we define that by this power series. So now, again, I have been going on a long time about these abstract objects and groups. I have groups, I have Lie groups. So how does this all come together? So how does this all connect to what we want to talk about? So how does this connect to the rotation group? So I promise you it's going to come very soon. So now this power series, again, it can be verified that this power series has nice properties, it's continuous, it converges uniformly and absolutely, etc., etc. So for those who know, who have taken a real analysis course, or those who know some theory of metric spaces, they know that proving this it's going to be a little technical, but it's going to be mostly easy, right? So now here is the thing. So if I think of this exponential matrix as a smooth curve, right? So if I have e to the tx, now this object, it's characterized by a real number t. Okay. And since this real number t is characterizing this object, we can think of this as a set of matrices in GLNR. Or let's say we can think of this as a set of matrices that varies continuously in the set of all matrices. And so in that sense, it's a curve because it's a smooth map between a real number, between real numbers and some manifold. And since it's a function of a real number, we can calculate the derivative, which I go into some detail here. And the derivative is this, right? So for example, like I was saying earlier, that if I have a curve and I take its derivative at some point, then that derivative is actually the tangent vector to that big space. So here I have given that example. So if I have any matrix, n by n matrix, and I have a curve that is given by this exponential map. So this exponential map is again a smooth curve in the set of all invertible matrices. So now I'm using again a non-trivial result that e to the tx. This matrix is invertible because its inverse is actually e to the minus tx. You can verify this by taking a product term by term and verifying that everything cancels and we are only left with identity. Now, it's a curve in GLNR, and we take the derivative of this curve at identity, right? At t is equal to 0, I have identity, and the derivative at 0, derivative of this curve at 0. So this tx, when t becomes 0, e to the 0 is identity. The derivative is x. Hence, this x is a tangent to this general linear group at identity. Okay, so this is again, when I talked about these tangent spaces earlier, this is what I meant. It's that so what I have shown here is that for any matrix, for any n by n matrix, it's a tangent to the group of invertible matrices at the identity, right? So given any matrix X, we can think of it as a tangent vector at identity to this group. Okay. Now, so now using this idea of a tangent space at identity, we're going to define what is a Lie algebra, right? So now we are given a group. Groups usually are quite complicated objects, right? So the group composition operation, it might not, it does not commute most of the times. For a rotation group, it definitely does not commute. So the structure is actually not very easy to analyze. So what this idea of a Lie algebra allows us to do is to linearize that group around identity and talk about linearized space, which is the Lie algebra. And when we have a linearized space, all our problems reduce to linear algebra problems, which usually are much simpler than group theory problems, right? So now here I'm defining a Lie algebra as a vector space. So this can be a real vector space, a complex vector space, and I have this bracket operation, which is bilinear and it obeys the Jacobi identity. Now, the physics people who have lost this at this point, they should start to pay attention, because this bracket operation, it looks an awful lot like the commutator in quantum mechanics, right? And the idea of the tangent space identity and this exponential map, this should have raised some suspicions about this being about infinitesimal generators of a group, right? So for example, those who have done a quantum mechanics course, they know that the momentum is an infinitesimal generator of the translation group. And that angular momentum is the infinitesimal generator of the rotation group. But now these terms are very physicsy, so only those who have done physics will understand it. So I'll explain what it actually means for something to be a generator. Okay. So I have a Lie algebra, and this Lie algebra has certain properties that make that make it easy for us to analyze them. So the prime property being that they're linear vector spaces, so it's easy. And as some examples of this Lie algebra, you can consider the R3 set of all vectors, and you can consider the cross product between two vectors as a prototypical example of a Lie algebra. Or more appropriately, you can consider the set of all matrices with this commutator defined this way as a Lie algebra. Now, in the next, what I'm going to do is associate a Lie algebra to every Lie group. Okay. So, for example, if I have the rotation group, I associate rotation group. I associate with this a Lie algebra, which is a vector space, and which is it's easier to analyze than this entire rotation group. Okay, so the Lie algebra of a group G, denoted by this Fraktur letter small g, is the set of all matrices such that e to the tx is in G for all real numbers t. So when we talked about the tangent space to the group of, to the general linear group, this is very similar to that in the sense that e to the tx is a curve inside this group, right? So in this group manifold, I have a curve that is characterized by t, and I can take the derivative of this curve, which gives me x e to the tx, and at identity, this derivative becomes just x, right? So what I'm doing is that I'm taking all these tangent vectors to this group G at identity and collecting them all together, and I'm calling them the Lie algebra of this set, right? So again, so now these tangent vectors x, these are what are actually the generators of a symmetry, right? So we have a symmetry group, we take the identity element, we calculate the tangent space to that symmetry group at the identity element, and everything in that tangent space, which is a vector space, is going to be my generator for a symmetry group, right? And I can I can exponentiate that generator to get my operation in the symmetry group. Okay. Now here is a property that given a matrix Lie group with associated Lie algebra G, as we have defined earlier, then this operation, the commutator, this commutation is closed and in the Lie algebra, right? So now this just tells us that the notion of taking the tangent space and saying that it is a Lie algebra, it's well defined. Okay. So I had written, I'll share these slides after the talk. So if someone is interested, you can go over all these proofs quite well. So you can go over these proofs and look at the technical details. And they've also added references to some texts that do a good job of explaining these things, right? So now we have the idea. So now I have introduced all these abstract ideas of a Lie group, of a tangent space to the Lie group, of Lie algebras. Now to see all of that in action, if we consider the Lie algebra On so the Lie algebra of the orthogonal group, then what happens is that we want the set of all such matrices X, or n by n matrices X, such that e to the tx is in On. But since so if this e to the tx is going to be an orthogonal matrix, then e to the tx transpose has to be equal to the inverse, right? So I have said this earlier. So e to the tx is so e to the tx inverse is e to the minus tx, which can be verified by term multiplication. And that condition, the condition that I require these matrices e to the tx to be orthogonal, gives us that the transpose of this matrix. So if this matrix is to be in the Lie algebra of On, then the transpose of this matrix should be equal to the negative of that matrix itself. So this is nothing but the condition that these matrices be antisymmetric, right? Moreover, so this On, it's the orthogonal group, and I've said that this orthogonal group consists of rotations and reflections. But if we remove the reflections from the orthogonal group, we're left with only rotations. So this SON is the special orthogonal group of n dimensions, and this group is actually a subgroup of the orthogonal group, and this only tells us about the only symmetry operation this has are rotations in n-dimensional spaces. Now here I have shown that in addition to being antisymmetric, the condition that these only be rotations, which manifests in itself in the condition that the determinant of these matrices is 1, this implies that the trace of my tangent matrices should be 0. But now this is trivial because all skew symmetric matrices have 0 because all the diagonal elements are 0, right? So now I denote by SO3, this small SO3, the set of traceless skew symmetric matrices that forms the Lie algebra for SON, right? Now SON, so SON, or in our case, we are mainly concerned with SO3. So this is my symmetry group. I calculate its Lie algebra SO3, which are the generators for these symmetry operations, and these elements of SO3 now in classical mechanics, those who have done a course on Lagrangian mechanics, they will know that in classical mechanics, in terms of generating functions of canonical transformations, we can say that the generators of rotations are angular momentum, right? So therefore, we identify this SO3, the Lie algebra of the rotation group, in some sense as the set of all angular momenta, right? In what sense do we identify that? I'll make clear in the next few slides. Okay. So now, if there are any questions up till this point, or any clarifications, anything, I'm open to questions now. So I see that there's a question that in which, when I talk about smooth maps, in which sense do I call them to be smooth? So, well, in terms of manifolds, so if I have manifold, I can generalize the derivative operation. And once I have done that, so I can also generalize to higher order derivatives. So in that sense, smooth means that I can take any order of derivatives of a map. So it's an infinitely differentiable map. So that is what I mean by smooth. So in physics, actually, we are very glib about things like smoothness and continuity. We assume everything to be smooth and infinitely differentiable. But in precise, what I mean by smooth is that it's, so again, so all these are smooth manifolds. Everything is very nicely behaved. We are not dealing with any pathological examples here. Okay, so are there any other questions? Okay, if not, then I'll start to talk about these homomorphisms. So people who already know group theory, for them, these homomorphisms are actually the heart of the subject. So group by itself is actually not very interesting. We want to talk about maps between two groups that preserve some sort of structure, right? So for Lie groups, it's extended in a very natural sense, is that if there's a map between two Lie groups, then we call that a Lie group homomorphism if one, it's a group homomorphism, and two, if it's continuous. Right. So again, it's a very straightforward generalization. Similarly, for a Lie algebra, homomorphism, I say that it's a linear map. So since Lie algebras are linear vector spaces, so so for just vector spaces, the homomorphism is just a linear map between those two vector spaces. But for Lie algebra, in addition to being a linear map, I also require it to preserve the commutation bracket structure of the space. Okay. So now these ideas are going to come in handy when I start talking about the representations of these groups. Okay. So now again, now this theorem here, it relates a group homomorphism to an Lie algebra homomorphism. So if I have a group homomorphism acting on some group element, exponentiated matrices, these belong to the group, and this X belongs to the Lie algebra, then this is just exponentiating the Lie algebra homomorphism applied on the matrix. Right. So now this tells us that in some sense, so now this makes precise the kind of relation we have between Lie groups and Lie algebras. So given a map between two Lie groups, we can construct a corresponding map between the corresponding Lie algebras, right? And it also turns out that this map is unique. So I'll not go into the technical details here. But the point is, so the point of showing this is that this map is actually the point of showing this is to demonstrate the connection between Lie groups and Lie algebras. Now we are going to start talking about representations of a group, right? So for example, in quantum mechanics, when we have a symmetry operation, we usually consider it to be some unitary matrix that acts on the state vector, right? So remember, in quantum mechanics, a state vector is some vector in an Hilbert space, and so for any symmetry operation, so for example, let's say the rotation operation. So the rotation group by itself, it's an abstract object, right? So how can you make sure that you have a precise way of having a rotation act on a state vector, right? So let's just consider finite dimensional states for now. So what we want is for a way for us to characterize these actions of groups on finite dimensional vectors. Okay, and that notion is captured in the notion of a representation, is that if V is any finite dimensional complex vector space on which we want to know the action of our group, then we can define a Lie group homomorphism between the group G, which we want to study, and the set of all linear maps over the vectors on which we want to study the representation. So in quantum mechanics, this space V is actually going to be some Hilbert space, and for us, this G is going to be the rotation group. Okay. And when this V is a complex vector space, we say that this is a finite dimensional complex representation. And similarly, so once we have a complex so how we have defined this for a matrix Lie group, we can also extend this to a Lie algebra, right? So it's going to be a Lie algebra homomorphism of the Lie algebra space G. So this again, so this is the set of all invertible matrices on the vector space V. So small GLV is the set of all matrices in the vector space G. So those who are interested, you can go back to the definition of a Lie algebra and try to figure out how I got this GLV as the set of all matrices on V. Right. Now here are some more definitions, some more properties of representation. So a representation is called faithful if the homomorphism is injective, right? So for every element in the group, there's only precisely one matrix in the vector space that that is mapped that is mapped to it under this representation. And also, if pi is a faithful representation, then the image set of all matrices in the group. So the image of all elements in the group, this is actually, as a group, this is isomorphic to our original group G. So in representation, what we are doing is we are expressing these abstract groups as some matrices, right? So the three-dimensional matrices I talked about. So the orthogonal group of 3 dimensions, for example, or the rotation group in 3 dimensions, when I wrote those down, they were just 3 by 3 matrices. But for example, let's say I want to study a spin half system which has in which the state vectors are contained in some C2, then I want a two-dimensional complex representation of the rotation group that I can act on state vectors of 2 by 2 systems. So that is the essence of representation theory. We want to determine up to isomorphism all the ways a group can act on a vector space. So how does my group act on a 3-dimensional vector space? How does it act on a 2-dimensional vector space? So that is what I want to find out in representation theory. Now, here is an important concept of the representation being invariant. So when I have a representation, representations are matrices of the groups. And if these matrices can be decomposed into block diagonal forms, then it means essentially that so when acting on a state vector, if all the matrices in my representation are in block diagonal form, then this means that actually there's no mixing between these elements of the vector and these elements of the vector. So in essence, this representation is not fundamental, right? It's composed of these two representations, which we can decompose into if such a decomposition exists. So we want to talk about invariant representations, which cannot be reduced in a block diagonal form like this. Okay, and a representation in which there are no which cannot be reduced into block diagonal parts is called an irreducible representations. So since all representations are going to be composed of irreducible representations, so if given a representation, it's either going to be decomposable into block diagonal form, or if it cannot be decomposed into block diagonal form, then it's irreducible. If it can be decomposed into block diagonal form, then the block diagonal representations, they are going to be irreducible. So in what seems like a daunting task, by studying all representations, now what this tells us is that we only need to study irreducible representations of these groups. Okay, so now here is a theorem that, so given a group and an associated Lie algebra and their representations, so this big pi and small pi, they are representations of the group and the Lie algebra on some vector space, on the same vector space, then because we have defined the representation as a Lie group homomorphism and a Lie algebra homomorphism, we can exploit that relation between Lie group and Lie algebra homomorphisms to relate these two representations. And that same theorem I stated earlier, that allows us to compute this representation. So it involves just taking the derivative of the group representation at t is equal to 0. Now again, this is very reminiscent of calculating the tangent vector, right? We are differentiating it with respect to t, and then we are putting t is equal to 0, so to get to identity. So even in the representation, that property is still here. It's still reflected, right? And so this is all I'm going to say about this. And again, so this again is so if my group G is connected, and then it's associated Lie, and it has an associated Lie algebra frac G, then so this connectedness is important. If my group is connected, then if the group representation is irreducible, if and only if the algebra representation is irreducible, right? So when we started out, we wanted to study the representations of all representations of groups. Now, then we said that no, we don't want all representations. We'll be fine if we only study irreducible representations. Now, what this theorem tells us, if our group is connected, then we don't even have to talk about the group. We only have to study about representations of this linear space of the Lie algebra, right? So, for example, in what we'll do next, we'll study the representations of the Lie algebra to the rotation group. Okay. Now, and again, so the second part also is the same thing. If G is connected again, and if I have two representations of the group and two associated representations of the algebra, then these two group representations are isomorphic if and only if these two algebra representations are isomorphic. Okay, so this theorem again demonstrates the deep connection between a Lie group and a Lie algebra. And the rotation group SO3, it is actually connected. So these nice properties, they hold here. Okay. So why this SO3 is connected? So one simple way to do this is to do a polar decomposition, and then we can construct some way of joining every rotation matrix to identity. So it's quite technical, so I'm not going to go into that. The only thing I'm going to go into is that I'll recall that the Lie algebra of SO3 is the set of all antisymmetric matrices, right? So it's a set of all antisymmetric matrices which are already traceless because the diagonals are 0. And this SO3 is a linear vector space. So very naturally, I can choose these three F1, F2, and F3 as the basis vector to that linear space. Okay, so now after 45 minutes of build-up and 45 minutes of setting the stage up, we are finally getting into talking about the representations of SO3. So the representations of the Lie algebra, the representations of the generators, right? So since we're talking about generators, it's actually, once we know all this, it's not surprising that this turns out to be connected to angular momentum, because these three matrices, they actually satisfy the angular momentum commutation relations, which we see in quantum mechanics, right? So if by F1, F2, F3, I replace them by Lx, Ly, and Lz, then these commutation relations, they are the same commutation relations which we observe for our angular momentum operators, right? So the angular momentum operators, in fact, are nothing but a representation of these three basis vectors in some complex vector space, right? So for example, if I have the space of all 2 by 2 matrices, or if I have a two-dimensional vector space for a spin half system, let's say, then the angular momentum there is going to be a representation of this group SO3 in a two-dimensional complex vector space, right? So now very quickly, we can also verify that these commutation relations hold, right? So here I have defined F1, F2, and F3 like this. So for example, F1, F2, and F3, I am going to pull up Python here, and F1, F2, F3 are defined like this. Then the commutator of F1 and F2, it's going to be equal to F3. The commutator of F2 and F3 is going to be equal to F1. And the commutator of F3 and F1 is going to be equal to F2, right? So these commutation relations hold. And now what we want out of these commutation relations is to use these to classify the irreducible representations, right? So let's start with an arbitrary, so any complex irreducible representation of SO3. So it's a group Lie algebra homomorphism between SO3 and GLV, where V is some complex vector space, and GL is the set of all linear operators on that vector space. And we're going to define L plus, L minus, and L3. So all the physics folks who I had lost in the first half of the talk, so they will recognize this. So this pi f3, this is nothing but the z component of the angular momentum L3, right? So like I said, so this is going to be so the representation is nothing but the angular momentum, so multiplied by this I, because in quantum mechanics we want to deal with real eigenvalues, and these pi's, since they're antisymmetric, so since they're antisymmetric, the eigenvalues are going to be completely imaginary, and that's a big no-no in physics. So we multiply everything by I to get, so this of course is due to convention, because what turns out in experiments, it's their real numbers. So that's why we multiply these representation of the basis elements by I. And we're also going to define these L plus operator and an L minus operator. These L3, L plus, and L minus, all these three are operators. All these three are linear operators on the vector space V. Okay, and since this is a Lie algebra homomorphism, it preserves the commutator bracket. Since the commutator bracket is preserved, we can use these commutation relations to verify the commutation relations for L2, so between these L3, L plus, and L minus. So again, so doing that is quite straightforward. So we want the commutator between L3 and L plus, which is going to be L plus. We want the commutator between L3 and L minus, which is going to be minus L minus. And we want the commutator between L plus and L minus, which is going to be 2 times L3. Okay, so these are the three commutations for between these three operators. Now, since this V is a complex vector space, these three operators, okay, so again, so now we have these commutators. Now we are going to use this commutation relations to do some things. So now we required our V to be a complex vector space. So since it's a complex vector space, algebraic completeness of complex numbers guarantees that L3 has an eigenvalue, right? So eigenvalue is just, so it means that there is a vector in V such that L3 times V is lambda V. Lambda can be a complex number. We don't know anything about lambda at the moment. But we know that there's a non-zero vector. So V is non-zero here. So we know that there is a non-zero vector such that L3 is, and so L3 acts on that V in this way. Now we know that. Then what we can do is we can try to find out how L3 acts on L plus V. So here I have added and subtracted L plus L3, and then identified this quantity as, so this identified this, and identified this quantity as the commutator here, and use the commutation relation from the previous slide to conclude that this L3 acting on L plus V is lambda plus 1 L plus V. So what this means is that either L plus V is 0, right? In that case, this becomes 0 equal to 0. Or if L plus V is non-zero, then L plus V is also an eigenvector of the operator L3 with the eigenvalue lambda plus 1, right? So if this L plus operator does not destroy our vector V, then it raises the eigenvalue of the it raises the eigenvalue of our vector by 1, right? So this is a consequence of this, So this is a consequence of this commutation relation. And from this other commutation relation, you can probably guess what we're going to do next. But before that, we can, so now our representation is finite dimensional. So we cannot keep we cannot keep acting our vector by L plus and keep getting non-zero vectors. So this cycle actually must stop at some point. So we must get 0 at some point. So let there be a k. So k is a natural number, a non-negative natural number, such that if L plus acts on V k times, then it's non-zero. And if it acts on V one more time, then it's 0. Right, so this is in some sense the eigenvector with the highest eigenvalue, right? And we're going to define V sub 0 as the highest eigenvector that is still non-zero, right? Now this k may very well be 0, right? So in that case, V naught is equal to V, and L3 V naught is equal to just lambda V naught. But since by acting on this Vk times, so every time the eigenvalue of V increases by 1, by acting on it k times, it will increase by k. And we define lambda plus k to be a mu. And thus this mu is the eigenvalue for our eigenvector V0. Okay. So now next, like I alluded to before, next we're going to consider the action of L3 on L minus V0. So L minus V0 again. So this tells us that L minus V0 is actually mu minus 1. So L minus is lowering the eigenvalue of the eigenvector, right? So that is provided that L minus V naught is not actually 0. So again, if by acting it just once it gets 0, then our representation, so then we have only one vector that we need to care about, and but we don't assume that at the moment. We assume that we define vectors m such that L minus m V naught. Okay, so Vm is L minus acting m times on the vector V naught that we define here. Okay, so first, so what we did was we were guaranteed an eigenvector due to the completeness of complex numbers. Then we acted on that vector, the L plus operator, such that it was the highest possible eigenvalue, till it was an eigenvector with the highest possible eigenvalue. Then we're going to generate eigenvectors of lower eigenvalues by acting on them by L minus. Okay. And so similarly, so L3 acting on Vm is mu minus mVm. So this means that, so every time L minus acts on on V0, the eigenvalue is lowered by 1 unit. So if L minus acts on V0 m times, then the eigenvalue will be lowered by m units. Now this computation people will, so the physics folks will recognize from the study of angular momentum, right? So we postulate that angular momentum operators are operators such that they satisfy certain commutation relations, which are based off of these commutation relations between the generators. And then we use these commutation relations to define a raising operator and a lowering operator that raises and lowers the eigenvalues. So that raises and lowers the angular momentum along z component of the system, right? So we can strip all of that out of this computation. So we can forget about quantum mechanics, we can forget about angular momentum, we can forget about any physical system, any underlying physical system. We can just start from the axioms of group theory and build representation theory on top of it in order to replicate that exact same computation and place this in the context of classifying representations of the rotation group. Okay. So now we have generated V naught. We have V naught, and we have generated things like V1, V2, etc. But again, this chain, we cannot keep lowering we cannot keep generating these VMs forever, right? This cycle has to stop somewhere. So because again, the underlying space is finite dimensional, so this cycle has to stop somewhere. Now, in order to see where that cycle stops, we are going to require this relation, right? So this relation, here is a quite straightforward proof of that relation, but I'm not going to go into that because we are running out of time. I'm just going to use this relation. So in order to, so what this relation is stating at a very basic level is that if I have the mth eigenvector and if I add L plus on it, I'll get an m minus 1th eigenvector and some multiplied by some numbers, right? So again, so this L plus is the raising operator, which lowers the index of the vector, but it raises the eigenvalue. Okay. So there is that. So this is a quite straightforward proof. So now since I have this, then we're going to take a number n such that Vn is non-zero, but Vn plus 1 is 0, right? So this is the same thing as before. So what we're doing here is that we are acting L minus on V naught capital N times, and that remains non-zero. And when we act L minus on it one more time, then it is becoming 0, right? So now this I can say, so now since Vn minus 1 is 0, then L plus acting on the 0 vector is going to be 0. But we can use the relation from the previous slide to write this. So to relate this n plus 1th vector to the nth vector, right? And since we're requiring this thing to be 0, and this Vn is non-zero by hypothesis, and n plus 1 is definitely non-zero because n is greater than 0 and we're adding 1. So the only choice we have is to put 2 mu minus m equal to 0, which tells us that mu must equal n by 2. Right. Now, again, so due to some, again, conventions, physicists define this mu to be L, which we call spin or the total angular momentum, which is equal to n by 2. So now remember that since this n is the highest non-zero eigenvector, the eigenvectors we have generated are V0, V1, up to n, up to Vn. Right. Now this, so 1 to n, that is 2 times L, and this V naught is an additional eigenvector. So the total number of eigenvectors we have generated is 2L plus 1. Right. Again, this 2L plus 1, again, this crops up. So this 2L plus 1 is called the total angular momentum. Right. So this is the dimensionality of the space spanned by these vectors that we have generated. Now, so now in the last 15 minutes, the computations we have done, we can combine all of those together in these 3 very nice looking relations. So these 3 very nice looking relations which determine the action of L3, L minus, and L plus on the space spanned by these 2 L plus 1 vectors. Okay. So now remember, when we started, we assumed that pi was an arbitrary irreducible representation of SO3, and by doing some manipulations, we found out that the vector space it is acting on. So the vector space that representation is acting on is this space, the space spanned by these V0, V1, V2, Vn. So, and since we assumed that the representation was irreducible, then it would mean that these v0, v1 to vn, these span the entire vector space V. If this were not so, then we would have basically have an invariant subspace, a subspace of the bigger vector space, a proper subspace of the bigger vector space that is invariant under the action of SO3, right? But that cannot be so, because by hypothesis we have assumed that the vectors, so that the representation was irreducible. So we can summarize. So again, so we can summarize our findings in the following theorem. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So now the dimensionality of our irreducible representation is 2L plus 1, where L is called the angular momentum or the spin. And since 2L plus 1 is the dimension of V, and dimension of vector spaces, finite dimensional vector spaces, they can only be non-zero natural number or non-negative natural number. So, which means that the possible values for this n are 0, half, 1, 3 halves, 2, etc. So, the possible values for n are integers and half integers, right? So, what we started with, so now this is where we stop in quantum mechanics. We say that L3, so the spectrum of L3 is these vectors from minus L to 0 to L, right? In our case, that will be from V0, V1 to Vn. These, remember, these are the two L vectors, and this is the one vector. So we say that this gives us the spectrum of the angular momentum operator. So what we do there is exactly the same thing. So in quantum mechanics, we want to look at the representations of the rotation group. Usually it's some function space, right? But when we do these computations, what we're doing is, when looking at representations on that function space, we're decomposing that representation into these finite dimensional irreducible representations of dimension 2L plus 1. Okay, so again, this does various things, like, so when we write the rotation operator, they're going to be block diagonal with blocks being 2L plus 1 dimensional. And all of these results we can summarize as follows. For any L, which is an integer or a half integer, there exists an irreducible representation of SO3, the Lie algebra SO3, of dimension 2L plus 1, and any two irreducible representations of SO3 of dimension 2L plus 1 are isomorphic. Right, so when we started with an arbitrary irreducible representation, so in the proof, we did not assume anything special. And what we got were all, so therefore what we got were all the finite dimensional representations of SO3. And now we're stating that given, so now since for each, so for every dimension of the vector space V, we had only one irreducible representation. We're going to state that, we are going to say that any two irreducible representations that have the same dimension are isomorphic. Okay, so now this result may very well be a statement of how angular momentum works in quantum mechanics. And again, so like I was saying earlier, so if we drop the condition that pi is irreducible, that is, we are given a vector in some Hilbert space, we don't know what the representation of the rotation group is in that Hilbert space, then we can say that if this is a finite dimensional representation, not necessarily irreducible, and V0 is a vector, is a non-zero element, is a non-zero vector, is a non-zero state vector, such that it is annihilated by the raising operator, so the state with the highest angular momentum, and such that this eigenvalue equation is satisfied, then this eigenvalue is either a non-negative integer or a half integer. And furthermore, these vectors defined by this span an irreducible subspace of dimension 2L plus 1. Okay, So this holds only over finite dimensional representations, because when we are talking about infinite dimensional spaces, things get very messy. The mathematics is quite sophisticated. So I'm not going to go into that, but this theorem 26 is actually a very powerful result, and it's a very powerful result, and to me it's a very beautiful result, because we have gotten something about we have gotten some information about a physical system by starting from abstract mathematical objects. So now here, as a final result, what I'm going to state. So I'm not going to state this final result. So this actually relates our representations of SO3 algebra to the Lie group. Okay. So I'm not going to even state this result because we have run out of time. And I'm going to end with these references. Okay. So for the basic theory of Lie groups and Lie algebras, and their applications in quantum mechanics, I would recommend these two books by Brian C. Hall. And for the theory of manifolds and differential forms, if you're interested in that, I'll recommend these lecture notes. Okay. So with that, I'll end my talk with this result. Okay. Thank you.